Ever wondered how Proverbs 3 can guide your daily life? Verse 1 reminds us to keep God's teachings close to our hearts. Verse 2 promises long life and peace when we follow His ways. In verse 3, we learn the importance of love and faithfulness. Verse 4 encourages us to seek favor and good success. Verse 5 emphasizes trusting in the Lord with all our hearts, and not leaning on our own understanding. Verse 6 assures us that He will guide our paths if we acknowledge Him. Verse 7 advises us not to be wise in our own eyes. In verse 8, we discover that wisdom brings health and nourishment. Verse 9 teaches us to honor the Lord with our wealth. Verse 10 promises overflowing blessings when we give generously. Verse 11 reminds us to accept the Lord's discipline with grace. In verse 12, we see that the Lord disciplines those He loves. Verse 13 celebrates the joy of finding wisdom and understanding. Verse 14 reminds us that wisdom is more valuable than riches. Verse 15 describes wisdom as more precious than jewels. Verse 16 tells us that wisdom offers long life and riches. Verse 17 highlights the peace that comes from walking in wisdom. In verse 18, wisdom is portrayed as a tree of life. Verse 19 shows how the Lord founded the earth with wisdom. Verse 20 illustrates how wisdom brings order to the universe. Verse 21 encourages us to keep sound judgment and discretion. In verse 22, wisdom is a source of life to those who hold it. Verse 23 assures us that wisdom will keep our paths safe. Verse 24 comforts us with the promise of peaceful sleep. Verse 25 warns against fear of sudden disaster. Verse 26 reassures us that the Lord will be our confidence. Verse 27 encourages us to do good whenever we can. In verse 28, we learn to not delay in doing good. Verse 29 advises us to avoid plotting harm against others. Verse 30 reminds us to not accuse anyone without cause. Verse 31 warns against envying the violent. In verse 32, we learn that the Lord is intimate with the upright. Verse 33 tells us that the Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked. Verse 34 shows that He gives grace to the humble. Finally, verse 35 reveals that the wise will inherit honor.